What would you do if, in the stillness of the night, you heard something moving beneath your bed? A scratch, a shuffle, something not quite human? Imagine lying there, trying to ignore it, telling yourself it's just your mind playing tricks. But deep down, you know something's waiting. And it's only a matter of time before it makes itself known. Tonight, as the rain softly taps against your window, let me take you into a place where your childhood fears are very real, and something sinister stirs beneath the surface. Don't look away. You might just want to sleep through the night, but this isn't something you can escape that easily. Before the fear begins, hit like and subscribe, don't miss the chills. Tell us where you're watching from, and brace yourself for stories so terrifying, they'll haunt your night. The rain tapped softly against the window, rhythmic and soothing, like a lullaby meant for the restless. Eli lay in bed, wrapped in the familiar embrace of his blankets, the faint sound of the storm the only thing keeping him tethered to the present. The rain had always been a comfort to him. Growing up, whenever a storm rolled in, it brought with it a feeling of safety, of being cocooned in something larger than himself. Something protective. It had been this way ever since he was a child, the rain a reminder of simpler days spent indoors with his mom, watching movies or reading books by candlelight when the power went out. But now, in the solitude of his apartment, the sound of the rain felt different. It wasn't the same soothing backdrop he had once known. It was quieter, more isolating. A reminder of how much he had grown apart from the warmth and familiarity of his childhood. The apartment felt empty, even with the rain outside and the sound of distant traffic murmuring through the night. There was a disconnect now, a separation between the peace he once felt and the unease he had come to know. Eli shifted in his bed, the soft rustling of the covers the only sound as his eyes roamed the dimly lit room. The light from the street lamps outside filtered through the blinds, casting thin slivers of light across the floor. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched longer as the night deepened, filling the space with a quiet tension. There was something about the stillness of the room, the emptiness, that seemed to press in on him. It wasn't the kind of stillness that brought peace, it was the kind that made you question whether you were truly alone. He let out a long breath, trying to shake the feeling. It's just the isolation, he thought. I've been alone too long. But even as he thought it, the noise started again. At first, it was so faint he thought it was a trick of his mind, a slight creak, the sound of wood shifting. Eli frowned, blinking in the dim light. He had lived in this apartment for nearly a year now, and it wasn't uncommon for old buildings to groan and shift with the wind. The plumbing made strange noises, the pipes seemed to moan in the night, and the floors creaked underfoot. It was all part of the charm, or so he told himself when he first moved in. It was just the house settling. He closed his eyes again, determined to shake off the unease that lingered in his chest. But then, the sound came again, louder this time, clearer. A soft, dragging sound, as though something or someone was slowly moving beneath the bed. Eli's heart skipped a beat. He opened his eyes, his breath catching in his throat. His mind scrambled for an explanation. The wind, he thought. It's just the wind. But as the sound persisted, his mind began to run wild. He sat up, pushing the covers off, his feet hitting the cold wooden floor with a soft thud. He turned his head toward the bed, where the sound was coming from, beneath the frame, just out of sight. His stomach twisted, a knot of anxiety forming in his chest. Get a grip, he told himself. It's nothing. It's just the house. The house is old, that's all. But even as he thought it, his fingers curled around the flashlight on his nightstand, a reflex he didn't fully understand. Without thinking, he flicked the switch, the bright beam cutting through the darkness, bouncing off the walls of the room. He focused it on the space beneath the bed, narrowing his eyes to make out any details. The light hit nothing but shadows. Eli swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. Nothing there. It's fine. It's fine, he repeated, trying to calm himself. He let out a shaky breath, glancing around the room as though searching for something, anything, that could explain the sound. But there was nothing. The sound had stopped. It was gone. The room was quiet again, save for the steady rhythm of the rain against the window. It's just your imagination, Eli thought. You're tired. That's all. You've been working too much lately. It's nothing. He lay back down, trying to relax his body, willing himself to fall back asleep. The bed felt cool beneath him, the covers wrapping around his body like a comforting cocoon. But the darkness of the room felt heavier now, like it was pressing in from all sides. His pulse thudded in his ears, the quiet growing more oppressive with each passing second. And then, just as he was starting to drift back off, the noise came again. This time, it was louder, more distinct. The scrape of something slow, deliberate, moving beneath the bed. Eli froze. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't the house settling. This was something else. Something was beneath his bed. He sat up quickly, the blankets falling away from his legs. His mind raced as his eyes darted to the floor. He was too afraid to move, but too terrified to stay still. The room felt far too silent now, and the noise from under the bed seemed to grow louder, closer, like something was just waiting to reveal itself. His fingers tightened around the flashlight, the light flickering as his grip shook. This is insane, he thought. It's just. But the words caught in his throat, and he found himself too afraid to finish the thought. A small bead of sweat gathered on his forehead as he slowly reached toward the edge of the bed. He hadn't even realized he had moved until his hand brushed against the floor. His body went rigid. The scrape came again, sharp this time, like claws dragging across the wood. Eli's heart hammered in his chest as he crouched down to the floor. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to see whatever was beneath that bed. But he couldn't stop himself. The need to know, to understand, was too great. It wasn't just fear that compelled him, it was curiosity. And something else. Something darker. A deep sense of dread, of inevitability, that seemed to pull him toward the edge of the bed. Slowly, he leaned forward, the flashlight beam shaking in his hand. The space beneath the bed was cloaked in deep shadows, the kind that swallowed up the light no matter how bright it was. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry. His eyes scanned the darkness, desperate for some sign of what was there. And then, just as he was about to shine the light into the shadows, the scraping stopped. A heavy silence filled the room, and for a moment, Eli thought he had imagined it all. Maybe the noise had been in his head, after all. But no, there was something more. Something was wrong. The air in the room had changed, thickened, like it was charged with something dangerous. His mind raced, torn between the need to investigate and the overwhelming urge to run. But there was nowhere to go. The bed was just there right in front of him, and whatever was under it, whatever had been making that noise, was still there. Waiting. Eli didn't move. He couldn't. The silence was deafening now, like the room had swallowed every sound, the rain, the wind, even the faint hum of the city outside. All of it disappeared the moment the scraping stopped, leaving only a heavy, almost suffocating stillness. His breath came in shallow gasps, his heart pounding so loudly in his chest that it felt like it could echo through the room. He kept his eyes locked on the space beneath the bed, his flashlight trembling in his hand, casting an unsteady beam into the blackness. For a long moment, nothing moved. Nothing stirred. It was as though the world itself had gone still, holding its breath. Eli wasn't sure how long he sat there, crouched at the edge of his bed, his mind racing, his body frozen in place. The room felt wrong. Not in the way that a creaky house or the wind through the window felt wrong. No, this was different. This was something deeper, something instinctive. His gut told him that whatever was underneath that bed wasn't something he should be looking at. But he couldn't look away. The seconds dragged by, stretching into what felt like an eternity, until Eli could no longer stand the silence. His fingers tightened around the flashlight, the metal of the handle cold against his palm. His breath came in a low, steady rhythm, the only sound that seemed to break the eerie stillness. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself, trying to silence the rising panic in his chest. Maybe I'm just overreacting, he thought, his mind grasping at any explanation that could bring him back to reality. It's just the wind. Or a rodent. Or something stupid like that. Nothing to worry about. Just calm down. But his instincts told him otherwise. The same instinct that had made him feel uneasy as a child when the dark corners of his room seemed to hold something more than shadows. That same instinct was screaming now, telling him that something was wrong, something was waiting beneath the bed. He slowly rose to his feet, moving cautiously, his muscles tight with fear. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more bizarre and terrifying than the last. What if it wasn't a rat? What if it was something far worse? Something that didn't belong in his apartment or in this world. With trembling hands, he stepped away from the bed, the flashlight beam sweeping the room as he backed toward the door. His heart pounded louder now, each thud like a warning. The air felt colder, the room heavier, as if the very walls were pressing in on him. He could almost feel the weight of the darkness closing around him, the shadows creeping closer. Then he heard it. A soft sound at first, almost imperceptible. A rustling, like fabric brushing against fabric. Eli's body went rigid. His breath caught in his throat as he turned to face the bed, his flashlight flickering nervously in his grasp. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to see what was there. But the sound, the way it tugged at his curiosity, at the same time as it sent a wave of cold dread rushing through him, he couldn't resist. The rustling sound grew louder, sharper, and then, something moved. A shadow shifted beneath the bed, and for the first time since this had all begun, Eli felt the overwhelming urge to run. He couldn't explain it, but everything inside him screamed at him to leave, to get out of this apartment and never look back. But his feet were glued to the floor, his body frozen in place. The beam of light caught something, a flash of movement, a glimpse of something that didn't belong. It was a blur, quick and unnatural, disappearing into the shadows just as fast as it had appeared. Eli's pulse raced. His hands shook, and for a split second, he thought he might drop the flashlight. He clenched his jaw, fighting the rising panic, his mind scrambling for a reason. Anything to explain what he had just seen. A trick of the light. A rat. A shadow. But no, the shadow had been too distinct. Too solid. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He had to know what was under that bed. With one last deep breath, Eli dropped to his knees, the cool wood of the floor sending a shiver through his legs. He held the flashlight steady, his hand still trembling. Slowly, he extended his arm toward the edge of the bed, shining the light into the deepest part of the shadows. At first, there was nothing. Just the same dark emptiness he had seen before. But then, his breath hitched as his eyes locked onto something moving slowly, deliberately right at the very edge of the bed. It was a hand. A pale, skeletal hand, fingers twitching, stretching toward the edge of the bed frame. Its long, bony fingers scrabbled against the floor, the nails sharp and ragged, like they hadn't been cared for in years. Eli recoiled, the flashlight slipping from his hand as he scrambled backward, his body crashing into the bed as his mind screamed in terror. The hand wasn't alone. The darkness beneath the bed was shifting, writhing, as if something was moving just out of reach. For a moment, everything was still again. The scraping stopped. The movement halted. Eli's chest heaved, his body slick with sweat as he sat in stunned silence. His mind refused to process what he had just seen. He wanted to turn away, to deny it, to believe that he had imagined it all. But the cold dread creeping down his spine told him the truth. What had been under his bed wasn't human. He stared at the empty space beneath the bed, the flashlight now lying on the floor beside him, the beam still flickering weakly against the wall. He could feel the weight of the darkness, pressing in on him, like it was watching him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. What do I do now? The question echoed in his mind, but there was no answer. He couldn't leave. The thought of walking away from this, of leaving his apartment with whatever that thing was under his bed, terrified him more than anything else. But the idea of staying, of confronting whatever it was, felt like a death sentence. His breath came in short bursts, his hands trembling as he finally forced himself to move. Slowly, carefully, he stood up, trying to keep his movements as quiet as possible. His legs felt weak beneath him, his knees wobbling, and for a second, he wondered if he might collapse. But he didn't. Eli backed toward the door, every step deliberate, his eyes never leaving the edge of the bed. His heart pounded in his ears, a steady thrum of terror that wouldn't stop. The sound of the rain outside seemed distant now, muted. There was only the quiet scrape of something moving beneath him, and the ever-present knowledge that something was there, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. The door felt miles away. The door felt impossibly far away, like a distant escape that would never come close enough. Eli's legs trembled as he backed away, his eyes still fixed on the dark shadows beneath his bed, where something unseen waited, just beyond the reach of his vision. The light from his fallen flashlight flickered weakly, casting erratic shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural directions. His mind raced, and the pulse in his throat hammered against his skin. His breath came in short, shallow bursts, and his heart thudded loudly in his chest. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was a primal urge to get out. To leave this place and never look back. To escape whatever had made its home under his bed. But with each step backward, something inside him felt more and more suffocated. The very air in the room was thick and cold, heavier than it had been just moments before. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to fling open the door and escape into the hallway. But as his fingers brushed the door handle, something stopped him. It was the silence. The scraping sound had ceased. The unnerving sensation of being watched had lifted for a brief moment, replaced by a strange, eerie quiet. A quiet so deep, so thick, that Eli could almost hear the sound of his own heartbeat in his ears. It was as if the room had taken a deep breath, waiting, watching. He stood frozen, his fingers still curled around the door handle, the metal cool against his skin. The shadows beneath his bed beckoned, a promise of something unspeakable waiting just out of reach. His eyes strained to make out any movement in the dark. But the bed was still. Empty. Silent. Maybe it's gone, Eli thought, though he didn't believe it. Not really. Not after what he had seen. The thought of stepping into that oppressive silence again sent a cold shiver down his spine. And yet, something kept him rooted to the spot. Something deep within him, a primal sense of curiosity, told him that he couldn't leave. Not until he understood what was going on. Not until he knew what had crawled into his life and under his bed. He let go of the door handle, slowly turning around to face the bed once more. He took a tentative step forward, his eyes never leaving the shadows. He could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on him. It seemed to thicken, like the room itself was closing in. With a deep breath, he dropped to his knees once again, this time deliberately, his hands reaching toward the flashlight. His fingers brushed against the cold metal, and he picked it up, turning it on again. The light flickered, then steadied, the beam cutting through the darkness, trembling slightly as he angled it toward the space under the bed. Nothing. There was nothing there. No hand. No shadow. No movement. Just the quiet, oppressive void beneath the bed. Eli's mind whirled. It's gone. It must be gone. I imagined it. It's just in my head. It's fine. But even as he tried to convince himself, there was a nagging feeling in his gut that told him the opposite. This wasn't normal. Nothing about this felt normal. His hand shook as he set the flashlight down on the floor beside him, the beam now casting long, eerie shadows against the walls. He stared at the space under the bed, eyes wide and alert. The air felt thick and heavy again, as if something was about to break the stillness. And then, it came. A whisper. Faint at first, almost imperceptible. It was like the sound of something soft brushing against the carpet, something small, almost delicate, until it wasn't. The sound came again, louder this time, more distinct. The unmistakable scraping of something dragging along the floor, slow and deliberate, like claws scraping against wood. Eli's heart slammed into his chest, the terror surging back with a force that left him breathless. His eyes locked onto the space under the bed. But this time, the sound wasn't coming from the shadows. This time, it was moving toward him. Eli didn't think. His body acted on pure instinct, jerking backwards so quickly that he nearly tripped over his own feet. He scrambled to his feet, his pulse pounding in his ears, the room spinning around him. The scraping noise followed him, a horrible, relentless sound that seemed to be coming closer, like something dragging itself across the floor toward him. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs were frozen. They wouldn't move. He could feel the cold sweat on his palms, his fingers slick around the flashlight. His breath came in ragged gasps as he backed into the wall, the scrape growing louder, more insistent. The room felt alive with it. With the noise, with the sense of something that wasn't supposed to be there. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Eli's chest heaved, his body trembling with fear, his heart still racing in his throat. The silence that followed was deafening. He stared at the edge of the bed, his eyes wild, waiting for the next sound to come. Waiting for the next thing to reveal itself. But it didn't. Nothing moved. The room was still again. Eli let out a shaky breath, his fingers clenching the flashlight so tightly that his knuckles went white. His entire body felt like it was on the edge, like he was hanging between two realities, the normal world outside and the twisted, horrifying thing that had crawled beneath his bed. It was tempting to believe that it was all in his head, to believe that he was simply overtired, or that his mind had been playing tricks on him. But he couldn't. Not after hearing that scraping. Not after feeling that presence, something waiting for him, just inches from his skin. He had to know what it was. He had to find out what had invaded his space. He couldn't just sit here, paralyzed by fear. With slow, deliberate movements, Eli dropped to the floor again, this time crawling on his hands and knees toward the edge of the bed. His pulse thudded loudly in his ears as he reached out, his fingers grazing the cold floorboards, and there it was again. The whisper. The sound was so faint, so subtle, that for a moment he wasn't sure if he had imagined it. But no. There it was again, louder this time, a sound like soft breathing, slow and deliberate, coming from beneath the bed. It was too much. Eli's stomach turned, bile rising in his throat as the weight of what he was hearing hit him. He couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, stifling. His eyes were locked on the space under the bed, his body trembling with the effort not to bolt out of the room. The breath came again, slow and steady, as if whatever was under there was waiting. Waiting for him to do something. To make the first move. Eli couldn't take it anymore. His heart pounded so loudly that he was sure the thing beneath the bed could hear it. With a burst of energy, he shoved the bed frame away, the metal screeching loudly as he jerked it out of place. And there, in the darkness beneath the bed, it waited. Two gleaming eyes, glowing faintly in the shadows, stared back at him. Eli's breath caught in his throat as the cold, reflective eyes stared back at him from beneath the bed. For a moment, he was frozen. His mind couldn't process what he was seeing. The light from the fallen flashlight trembled in his hand, casting weak beams over the figure that lay hidden in the shadows. There was no mistaking it now. What stared back at him wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't a rat, or a piece of furniture, or some figment of his imagination. It was something alive. Something other. Its eyes glowed with a faint, unnatural light, reflecting the dim glow of the flashlight like twin pools of mercury. The rest of its form was hidden in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the light. But the eyes were enough to send a cold shiver through Eli's spine. They weren't the eyes of any animal he knew. There was an intelligence behind them. A knowing, predatory gleam that made every hair on his body stand on end. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls were waiting for something to happen. Eli's heart thundered in his chest, and the air felt impossibly heavy, thick with something malevolent. What was it? What was it? And why was it here? Eli's fingers tightened around the flashlight, his knuckles white with tension. His eyes never left the gleaming pair of eyes beneath the bed, as if staring at them would somehow reveal the truth. But the more he stared, the less certain he became. It was as though the creature was watching him with the same curiosity, like it was studying him, waiting for him to make a move. It didn't seem to be in any rush to attack. But then again, neither did Eli. With a slow, deliberate movement, Eli dropped to his knees, the floor cold against his skin. He wasn't sure what he was doing. Fear had locked his mind in a vice grip, but a strange, almost irrational curiosity kept him anchored in place. It was as if the creature's eyes had ensnared him, held him hostage, and his legs refused to move. Slowly, he inched the flashlight closer to the edge of the bed, aiming its beam directly at the creature's eyes. The light flickered and buzzed, casting strange, jittery shadows across the room. But it didn't matter. The eyes stayed fixed on him, unwavering. Something in the air shifted then. The temperature seemed to drop, the room feeling suddenly much colder. The shadows beneath the bed deepened, thickening like ink bleeding into the edges of the room. The creature's gaze never left Eli's face, and in the silence that followed, he swore he could feel something pressing against him. The weight of the darkness. A chill ran down his spine as he heard it. The first sound from the creature. It was low, soft, almost like a sigh, but there was something unsettling about it. The sound wasn't from its mouth. No, the noise seemed to come from deeper within, like something inside the creature was resonating. Eli's pulse quickened. What was that sound? Was it breathing? Before he could process the thought, the creature moved. The shift was barely perceptible at first, just a flicker in the shadows. But it came with a sudden burst of speed, crawling out from beneath the bed with a grotesque, bone-crunching noise. Eli's breath caught in his throat as the thing emerged fully into the dim light. It was long and serpentine, its body twisting and slithering like something not meant to walk on legs. Its skin was pale and slick like the underside of a fish, glistening under the flashlight's weak beam. Long, gnarled limbs sprouted from its body, jointed and wrong in ways that defied logic. Its head, now fully visible, was small in proportion to its body, too small for something so unnatural. But its eyes, those were what kept Eli rooted to the spot. They weren't just glowing now, they were alive. Alive in a way that made the hairs on his neck rise. They flickered with malicious intent, like burning coals. The thing's mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth that glinted in the darkness. It made no sound, no growl or hiss. Just the unnatural creak of its body, and the silent, predatory motion as it slowly advanced toward him. Eli couldn't move. Every ounce of his being screamed at him to run, to escape while he still could, but his legs refused to obey. The terror had him in a grip so tight that even the thought of bolting for the door felt impossible. His mind was clouded with dread, but it was the presence of the creature that paralyzed him. It was so wrong. The thing inched closer, its long, spindly legs brushing against the floor as it drew nearer. Its eyes never left his, unwavering and unblinking. Eli could feel its gaze cutting into him, like it was tearing into his very soul. Was this its hunting ground? Had it been waiting for him all this time? Was he the prey? His breath was shallow now, his heart racing faster than he thought possible. The room seemed to shrink around him, the walls pressing in with every slow, calculated step the creature took. It was close now, so close that Eli could almost feel the heat radiating from its body, though the temperature in the room was freezing. It was as if the creature's very presence was warping reality itself. And then, with a sudden, bone-chilling movement, the creature lunged. Eli didn't even have time to think before the thing's long, jagged limbs shot out like spears. Its claws, no, its talons sliced through the air toward him. The flashlight flew from his hand, skittering across the floor, its beam casting wild shadows across the room. Eli twisted away, barely avoiding the sharp claws that slashed through the air just inches from his skin. The creature's screech echoed in his ears, a sound like 1,000 nails scraping against a chalkboard. It was unbearable, so shrill that it rattled his bones, but it didn't matter. He had to get out. With a burst of adrenaline, Eli scrambled to his feet, his body moving on pure instinct now. He didn't look back as he darted toward the door. He only had one thought: escape. The thing under his bed was real, and it was trying to kill him. He reached the door and yanked it open with all his strength, stumbling into the hallway, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't stop to look. He didn't stop to think. All that mattered was getting as far away from that apartment as possible. He ran down the hall, into the stairwell, his legs carrying him faster than he'd ever moved before. His feet slammed against the stairs with every step, but the terror inside him fueled his desperation. The creature had followed him. He could hear it, its screeching, scraping sound echoing through the walls. Eli burst out into the street, the cold night air biting at his skin. He didn't stop running until he reached the corner, panting, sweating, heart racing as if it might leap out of his chest. But even then, even with the safety of the outside world around him, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The creature's eyes were still burning in his mind, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he could still feel its presence, lurking in the shadows. Eli stood in the cold night air, his breaths coming in ragged gasps as his body trembled from the adrenaline still surging through him. The city lights flickered in the distance, casting an eerie glow across the streets, but Eli couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't truly safe. The creature, its eyes still burned into his memory, was still out there, somewhere. The shadows seemed deeper, as though the very world around him was warped by the terror that had followed him from his apartment. He couldn't go back. Not now. Not after what he'd seen. But where would he go? His mind raced, his thoughts scattered and frantic. The sense of dread that had gripped him in that room hadn't loosened its hold. It had only intensified, now that he was outside, exposed. In the light of the street lamps, the world felt almost normal, but inside, the terror gnawed at him, relentless. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting the creature to emerge from the shadows. The thought was irrational, but it clung to him like a second skin. He needed to think. He needed to do something. Maybe it's gone. It has to be gone. It can't be real. It can't. But the voice in his head was faint, drowned out by the images of the thing's eyes, the sound of its claws scraping across the floor, the way it had lunged toward him with such unnatural speed. He couldn't let himself believe that. Not after everything. I need help, he thought, the desperation making his breath come even faster. But where could he go? Who could help him? His phone was still in his pocket, but the thought of calling anyone seemed so distant, so futile. How could he explain what had happened? How could anyone believe him? The streets were eerily quiet, the sounds of the city muffled by the thick haze of fear that clouded his mind. The cold air bit at his skin, but it did nothing to shake the feeling of being watched. It felt as if the night itself was pressing in, closing around him. Eli's feet moved almost on their own, taking him down the street, away from the apartment building. He couldn't stay there. He couldn't go home. Not with that thing still out there. As he walked, his thoughts kept returning to the creature. Its eyes had burned into his soul, and the sound of its screeching claws was still ringing in his ears. Even now, his body tensed at the faintest noise, every rustle of leaves or creak of metal setting his nerves on edge. It was as though the creature's presence was still lingering, following him in the shadows. Why me? Eli thought, his heart sinking. Why did it choose me? But the more he thought about it, the more the terrifying possibility began to creep into his mind. What if it hadn't chosen him? What if it had always been there? What if the creature was just waiting for the right moment? What if there were others like it, lurking in the shadows, unseen, waiting for someone to cross their path? The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through him, his stomach twisting into knots. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His legs carried him faster, the beat of his footsteps echoing in the silence. His breath was sharp and uneven now, a cold sweat beginning to form on the back of his neck. He needed to find somewhere safe. Somewhere the creature couldn't reach him. But safety seemed like an illusion. He reached a nearby park, the trees towering above him like dark sentinels. The stillness of the place should have been comforting, but instead, it only deepened the feeling of dread that had settled into his bones. The park was empty, no one else around. The benches were empty, the walking paths deserted. But as Eli walked through the park, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was there. Something watching him from the shadows. Every rustle of the trees, every soft crack of a twig underfoot, sent his heart into overdrive. He found a bench and sank down onto it, burying his face in his hands as the weight of everything crashed down on him. The creature. The terror. The relentless sensation of being hunted. Eli wasn't sure how long he sat there, but when he finally looked up, it was as if the world had shifted. The air felt heavier, the trees casting unnerving shadows, their branches swaying despite the stillness of the night. It was then that he saw it. At first, it was a blur, a movement out of the corner of his eye. Eli turned quickly, his heart skipping a beat as he scanned the park. There, near the edge of the trees, was a shadow. A figure. A silhouette, standing just out of the reach of the streetlights. Eli's stomach lurched. He couldn't see clearly, but the figure seemed familiar. Too familiar. The way it stood, so still, so unnervingly quiet, reminded him of the creature under his bed. No. It can't be. It can't be. The shadow shifted, just slightly, and that was enough to send Eli into motion. His legs carried him without thinking, panic surging through him as he scrambled to his feet and began running. Running faster than he thought possible, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His heart pounded so loudly in his chest that it drowned out all other sounds, but his feet never stopped. He didn't look back. The sound of footsteps behind him, slow and deliberate, echoed in his mind. He had to get away. He had to escape. His body felt heavy with fear, but he pushed forward, as though the very act of running could protect him. It's not real. It's not real. It's just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, he knew the truth. It wasn't a trick. It was real. It was following him. Eli didn't stop running until he reached the streets, the familiar city lights blurring in his vision. He stumbled to a halt, panting, hands on his knees as his body screamed for rest. But the feeling of being hunted, of something close, it didn't go away. He couldn't go back to his apartment. He couldn't stay here, either. Where could he go? Where was safe? He looked up, his breath still shallow as his mind spun with the possibilities. He needed answers. He needed to know what he was up against, what had followed him from under that bed. But deep inside, Eli knew whatever this was, whatever had found its way into his life, it wasn't going to let him go that easily. The creature wasn't finished with him yet. Eli's breath was a shallow, frantic gasp, the only sound in the room besides the scraping of the creature's limbs across the wooden floor. His body was rigid, locked in place by the sheer terror that coursed through him. The eyes of the creature, glowing with a strange, unnatural light, bore into him with an intensity that felt like they were reaching into his very soul. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to run, to escape, but his legs wouldn't move. His mind spun in chaotic circles, trying to make sense of the terror unfolding before him. He had seen the creature in the darkness, felt its presence, but this was different. It was here now, real and tangible. It had come for him. The creature took another slow, deliberate step toward him, its limbs twisting unnaturally with each movement. Eli could see its form more clearly now, the pale, almost translucent skin stretched too tight over its bones, its long, spindly fingers that looked like they could easily puncture flesh. The air in the room grew colder, heavier, as though the very temperature was being sucked out by the thing's presence. Eli's hand tightened around the flashlight, his knuckles white. It was all he had. But what could he do with it? How could something as fragile as a flashlight possibly fend off the monster standing before him? The creature's mouth opened slightly, revealing rows of jagged teeth that looked too large for its thin frame. It didn't make a sound. Instead, its eyes never left Eli's, as if it were waiting for something. Waiting for him to make the first move. For a split second, Eli's mind flashed to the photograph under the bed. The Morrow family. What did they have to do with this? Why had the creature been lying in wait, in the shadows, for so long? And then it hit him. The creature wasn't just a mindless thing, hiding beneath beds. No, this was something older, something tied to that family, to that photograph. The Morrow family hadn't been its first victims, and they wouldn't be the last. The creature had been lurking in the dark for generations, waiting for someone to cross its path, to unknowingly awaken it from its slumber. It had been waiting for him. Eli swallowed, his voice trembling as he tried to speak. "What do you want?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but somehow, the creature heard him. Its head tilted slightly, as though considering his question, its eerie eyes gleaming in the dim light. The air grew even colder, and Eli could see his breath clouding in front of him, each exhale coming in shaky bursts. His mind was racing, but one thing became painfully clear. There was no way out. The creature had cornered him, and there was no one to help him. It was just him and the thing in front of him. Suddenly, the creature made its move. With a terrifying speed that Eli couldn't even process, it lunged forward, its claws outstretched, reaching for him. Instinctively, Eli swung the flashlight toward it, but the creature was faster. It knocked the flashlight from his hand, sending it skittering across the floor, the beam of light flickering out as it rolled to a stop. Eli's heart skipped a beat as he felt the creature's cold fingers brush against his arm. Panic surged through him, but his body was frozen in terror, his legs too weak to carry him. He was powerless. But then, something shifted. As the creature loomed over him, its face mere inches from his own, Eli felt the weight of his fear begin to dissipate, replaced by something far colder. A strange clarity washed over him. He wasn't going to make it out alive. He wasn't going to survive this. But maybe, just maybe, he could end it. End it for good. He remembered the photograph, the shadow in the background, the way it had watched them. The Morrow family. What if the creature was tied to them, tied to that house, to that photo? What if the key to ending this wasn't fighting it directly but understanding it? With shaky hands, Eli reached into his pocket, pulling out the photograph again. The creature's eyes followed his every move, but it didn't make a sound. It was waiting. Eli held the photograph out toward the creature, his voice trembling. "I know what you are. I know you're tied to them." His words were uncertain, but he knew he had to say something, anything to break the tension. "You were never meant to be free. You were always meant to stay in the shadows." The creature's movements froze. For a moment, everything was still. The room seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with anticipation. The creature didn't move, didn't speak. Its glowing eyes locked onto the photo, and Eli watched, almost in awe, as it hesitated. It was as if it were considering his words. Then, the creature let out a low, guttural growl, a sound so deep and chilling that it reverberated in Eli's bones. The shadow behind it, the shadow in the photograph, seemed to flicker, as though it were alive. The creature's form began to distort, its edges blurring and shifting, as if it were being pulled back into some other dimension, some other place. Eli's heart pounded in his chest as he held his ground, unwilling to look away. He didn't know what was happening, but he couldn't afford to blink, to doubt. This was his chance. He had to finish it. The creature began to fade, slowly at first, then more rapidly, its form crumbling into the darkness. With one final screech, the creature disappeared completely, leaving the room once again silent. Eli stood there, his body trembling, his heart still racing. His chest heaved with each breath, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Was it over? Was it really gone? The photograph dropped from his hand, and for the first time in days, Eli felt something resembling peace wash over him. He was alive. He had survived. But he knew, deep down, that it wasn't truly over. Whatever had happened to the creature, whatever had made it retreat, it was only temporary. The shadows still lingered. They always would. But for now, at least, the creature under his bed was gone. And that was enough.